And I'm excited because Andy is one of the most complicated people I know. He has many different versions of himself. He's a musician, he's a comedian, he's a punny guy, he's a psychotherapist, he sees clients, he's a poet, and then he's also a lawyer and my boss.
Yeah, I think when I was thinking of a hero's journey, Ashley, I was reminded of C.G. Jung, the great psychologist, and they asked him, so what's with therapy? I mean, what is the goal of therapy? Because it sounds everyone talks about it, it's very amorphous. What is the actual goal of therapy? And Jung said, well, the goal of therapy is not to live your life, but to live your life. To live your life. And I think that's one of the most difficult things in the world to do. Not the life that people expected of you, that your parents want, the society demands, that perhaps your faith community demands, but actually to really do the inner work, enough inner work, so that despite the vicissitudes of life, and we know terrible things happen, right? We know about serious illness, we know about death, and we know about poverty, and we know about professional setbacks. Despite all of these things, which will happen and probably have happened to everyone who's listening, nevertheless, the inner work allows us to persevere in our inner journey, in being as humane as possible with one another and as kind as we can be, and as understanding as we can be of both our conscious and unconscious lives. Very difficult, very difficult, very difficult. So I think that's all heroic. I think the inner work is as heroic as the outer work. The outer work is more celebrated, because you win this lawsuit, or, you accomplish this huge goal for yourselves. But I think that the heroic is also the inner work. And I think that's really important. I think it's really important for activists too. Sometimes, actually, I think some of us are sort of tempted to get into what I call diseased altruism. Diseased altruism. And what that means is that, fighting for animals that are being horribly abused and tortured in our animal factories, or fighting against pesticides, or fighting against Bayer, Monsanto. Sometimes we can project all of our inner issues to those outer issues, not be dealing with our relationship, not be dealing with our angst, with our despair, with our depression or anxiety, not dealing with the grief lines in our lives, but projecting it all on that. And that leads to, so Laurence Olivier said, I don't mind good actors, I don't mind bad actors, but I can't stand earnest actors. And that's how I feel about activists, because when you're not dealing with your inner work where it needs to be dealt with, but projecting it out, there's a kind of ferocity that comes out. Now, you can't understand my Monsanto and GMOs. It's the word, that is, first of all, it's not going to attract many followers. And it's a real issue that we have to make sure, because we're fighting for such good causes. But let's make sure that holism is holy for all of us doing this work, that we live our full lives in the inner and outer ways. I think that holism is holy is a really good motto for how to be a good activist, because people know that, people sense that about you, whether you're sort of moved into projecting and that's the wrong kind of energy, or whether they can see your work as part of the whole gamut of who you are as a person. I think it's a much better way to proceed in our work, and not always easy.
I think more than any of the guests we've had thus far, you might be able to help our listeners understand the sort of classic hero's journey myth and the work of Joseph Campbell, and why that work sort of grounds our thinking in this podcast.
Well, we're sort of unusual among, mammals in that we're so helpless when we're born. I have grandkids now, and I've got a granddaughter who's, 4.5 months old, and two grandsons, the youngest who's 15 months old. And so, it reminds, of course, I have two children of my own, which is my grandchildren, a son and a daughter.
The math there works.
And boy, you just realize how helpless we are. And how much we need to depend on so many others just to get to stand up and to begin to become, sort of 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, go to school. All that takes a huge amount of time and development. And then there comes this moment in all of our lives when it's time to move away from that. When it's time when we have to move away from that and begin our journeys. And that is difficult in any case, but I think it's incredibly difficult in this society because we're a very Darwinian society. We're a sort of sink or swim society, which is terrifying, especially when you're, the suicide rate between 18 and 24 is huge. It used to be just mostly boys. Now it's, boys and girls that age. It's really almost an epidemic with older people too now as well. And that's because that's when that's when you have to then try and enter this society. If you were lucky enough to have the care of a family and you were mirrored and modeled and facilitated, and suddenly you're facing, this sink or swim society, it can be terrifying. If you happen to be an introvert, if you happen to be in the arts, all the things that the society does not favor. It's a heavy extrovert, heavy sensate, heavy judgmental society. Well, if you're an introvert and you're a feeling function sensate and perceptive person, you are just from the beginning, Ashley, fighting the entire trend of the society. That's heroic. That's heroic. So that breakaway from the family, that ability then to somehow find a way to persevere in a very, very difficult society. And then, hold your breath, actually learn ways to struggle against the inequities of society, learn to struggle for the oppressed, struggle for the rest of the earth community, the non-human earth community, to then somehow be able to, to do that is heroic. And that's, I think, a lot of what this series is about. But it's heroic, just ab initio from the beginning. It's heroic. But I think when you're able to do that, first of all, you're probably lucky. I know I feel very lucky. But better, it's better to be lucky than to be good in so many different ways. But still, yeah. So that's as a therapist, as a part-time therapist, outside of my other work, I just have so much compassion for the difficulties of what it means to be a human being, all the things that we set in space. And I don't think anybody I know embodies that kind of everyday heroism, having faced all of those vicissitudes, as I said earlier, than you, Ashley. You have faced every one of those. So at some point, you're going to have somebody interview you to complete the story.
So, Andy, I'm wondering if you can give our listeners a sort of 0 to 18 flashback of your life. Like, where did you grow up? Did you always know you were going to be a lawyer and fight the machine? Like, what's the origin story?
Yeah, well, I was actually like somebody else on this podcast, born in Texas.
Hey, I was born in New Jersey, actually, but raised in Texas.
Actually, many years ago, I was the Utne Reader, which was a popular magazine for a period of time, and I knew Eric Utne, who and his wife Nina, who initiated that, and they named me one of the 100 leading visionaries in the world. And then they had a town hall meeting where many of us visionaries spoke, and I recollect very, very, very vividly that I was the 5th that spoke. And I noticed that the first 4 that spoke before me all wore glasses, rather thick lenses, as a matter of fact, in those days, as do I. And it then occurred to me that maybe the requirement of being a visionary is that you really can't see at all. And so that's really just the first of many, many errors I will make, myopic errors I will make during this interview. But I was born in Texas and then lived my early life in California. My mother was in TV and in the performing arts. And then we moved to New York when I was 11, where I stayed for almost 25 years. My ambition in life was to be a musician, to be a concert pianist. And to this day, I love piano and I love music. I think if history were different, if the challenges weren't there, I think I would have stayed a musician. To me, I don't know who said it, Ashley, but someone said that all arts aspire to the condition of music. I mean, music is, you can't argue with music. There's no rational thinking with music, right? I mean, there's lots of, interesting technique and theory about music, but the piece of music itself is unique in all the other arts. It happens in real time. And I think in many ways mimics nature. All of nature is sort of non non it's sort of it's non-repetitive, but it's every oak tree is different. So we have patterns. We see life in patterns, and music reflects that consciousness. So you have this sort of non-identical repetition in music and in all of nature, because we don't really see things, we see patterns. And then we put those patterns into, oh, that's a tree, that's a chair, that's a person. And music reflects that's very true to that. And then it layers those patterns, right? When a Bach fugue or a Beethoven symphony or a Beethoven sonata layers those patterns. And then the kicker is it layers them with emotional tones. So you have all these patterns in music, and they each evokes an emotion. And all that comes from something very natural, the overtone series. It's based in nature. Nature gives us the tonic chord of C, E, G, and then we play with it because that's harmonious. The basic is harmony, and then we create the disharmony. So it's just a whole phenomenal palette for emotional life as an analog for our own emotional life. So I love music very deeply. And I think that in many ways, because of what I just said, music is truer to life, much truer to life than science. It's actually a better reflection of how we are. So I practice and play music to this day. But as I got older and realized that being a concert pianist probably wasn't going to be a very successful endeavor. I was mostly teaching and accompanying music, which I liked both of them, right? And then of course, history came to meet me, when we're talking about the 70s and all of that very turmoil time. And I just said I decided to switch my profession and say, listen, I'm going to go from being a musician to being somebody who needs to try and make history. I wasn't sure how. And then I ended up going to law school. So music stayed my hobby. So I went from my profession, my hobby, and then sort of my hobby, which was politics. I grew up in a very political family. That then became my profession, and it was a tremendous move. And I'm very grateful that somehow the powers that be, the intuitions that be, led me in that direction.
I will say for folks listening, I recently went and saw Holt's symphony, The Planets, and it was for me the first visceral time I felt as though nature had channeled its brilliance through a musician and spoke the energy of the planets through this conduit. It was a really kind of psychedelic, psycho-spiritual experience for me. So if you're kind of thinking and wanting to experience what Andy sees in music, I would suggest that symphony, and we'll put it in the show notes. And it's kind of the basis of Star Wars music, so you'll kind of hear that. So Andy, you become a lawyer.
Probably Holst the planets, yeah. Also, by the way, think how physical that is. Music has a beat, and so we have, in our chest we have a double beat, right? We've got the heartbeat and then the lungs breathing. So we're fundamentally rhythmic creatures. And music is able to meet us, not just in the spiritual and emotional realm, but meet us in that most basic thing of the heartbeat and that sort of syncopation of heart and lungs. So it's really deep. And of course, those of us who are gifted to play I tried to play the violin for years. Terrible. I tried to play guitar, cannot do it. But for some reason, I have the ability to play the piano. And again, for all of those who have those gifts, I think we should all realize how lucky we are, how lucky we can then use our hands to actually communicate in this way. It's very, very beautiful. And by the way, a tremendous help for me, because a lot of what I have to deal with and what you have to deal with is not pretty. It's not thinking of the cancers that pesticides are creating, thinking of the devastation to the rest of the earth community, the endangered species, think of them dying out, think of the biochemistry of the planet changing in this horrific way that we're seeing, that could lead to the undermining the entire survival of not just the creatures on the earth, but the planet itself. These are very difficult things to deal with, really difficult things. And to know there's people who are being paid to do that. We're getting billions of dollars of our taxpayer monies, right, to destroy the planet, right? $20-30 billion to the fossil fuel companies, billions of dollars going to industrial agriculture, basically paying them, giving them subsidies to destroy the planet. And this is not easy stuff, as everybody listening knows. And so to be able to have something like music, to be able to have that, to come back to is, and to bring us to that other plane, I find it's incredibly therapeutic, and I'm very fortunate to have that.
Yeah, that is a theme that's been emerging very unexpectedly for me. But I think it maybe is rooted in this reclamation of the feminine that you and I have been talking about offline. But throughout this podcast, as we've been interviewing folks, a theme has come up about actually enjoying the magnificence of this planet and human beings, that we are the earth. We are also magnificent, and we have to find spaces of joy, whether that's through just being in nature, hugging a tree, meditating, music, art, like letting that creative, beautiful energy move through you and fight like hell against the bastards.
Yeah, there's a wonderful book by C.S. Lewis called Surprised by Joy. And even the title is great, because I think in life, if we're open to it, we will constantly, despite everything we all know, we will find ourselves surprised by joy. We'll find, because we're made for that. We're made for that as spirits, to be surprised by joy, and it's a lovely deal. And I think as far as warriors are concerned, lovers always make the best warriors. Right? People who just live to make war are as cynical and as and often as evil as one can imagine. Right? But when you're a lover and you are defending that which you love, right? Your fundamental thing is not to fight. Your fundamental thing is not to oppose, not to confront. Your fundamental thing is to fall in love, right? So if you fall in love with bees, you fall in love with trees, you fall in love with rivers, you fall in love with mountains, you fall in love with people, you fall in love with animals. That is that people always ask me, so how can I become an environmental activist? What should I do? And my first thing is fall in love. If you haven't already, fall in love. And I don't know a single environmental lawyer, activist, anybody I've ever met worth their salt who's ever said to me, I'm in this to make more efficient use of natural resources. Never one. We're in this because we love those rivers and we'll defend them. Right? We're in that because we love those plants, we love those trees, we love those bees, we love the diversity. And then when we see it hurt, we fight. And that's the place where this should come from, I think, from all of us, because that's the very first thing. So yeah, so if you're out there and you're young and you say, well, what's it going to take to be an like so many of the heroes that you're interviewing in this podcast, fall in love, folks. Go out there and fall in love, and then you will defend it.
So you're at NYU, going to law school.
Yeah.
Major shift away from music and this sort of like creative, soulful side of you. When did your law career take the hard right turn into public interest litigation? Because I know you didn't go to an environmental law program and launch into environmental litigation. In fact, you sort of wrote the pathway into food law. So tell us a little bit about that transition.
Yeah, well, when I first went to NYU, I was interested in an environmental program, but they had just abandoned it. So, and this is the early 80s. Literally upon my arrival, they closed the environmental law program. So, I have this disagreement with a lot of the great lawyers that we've worked with and have on as colleagues on our staff. So many of them love law school. I hated law school. I got to tell you, there was a few classes I liked, constitutional law. There was some interesting philosophy and law classes they gave us sort of on the side, but oh my goodness, no, I did not like law school. And but I did know that I needed that tool to try and do what I wanted to do. I did work in corporate law very briefly, and I'll never forget. I was working in a corporate law firm in Portland, Maine. And I was in the bank building, if those who know Portland, Maine. It was 10th floor. Bernstein, Shore, Sawyer, Nelson was the name of the law firm. And at that point, there was a demonstration. There's a plaza beneath it. And at that point, there was a demonstration opposing the U.S. involvement in El Salvador. And for those not old enough to remember that, our CIA basically overthrew their government. We even shot their, nuns. We shot, very, very, I think a bishop. And it was just... And all the lawyers, the corporate lawyers on the 10th floor, looking around, making fun of the demonstrators. And of course, I had been brought up in a very left wing and a very, socially responsible family. And I said, I don't belong up here with them. I belong down there with them. So I went home, told my family, my wife, I said, hey, we're going down to Washington. I'm not going to do this anymore. And I had some great mentors, Ralph Nader and Jeremy Rifkin. And I remember sitting there with Ralph, actually even earlier in a class that he gave at NYU on activism and the law. And they said, if you don't like the news, make the news. If you don't like history, make history. And I thought that was really cool. And I was very fortunate to run into this brilliant man, Jeremy Rifkin, who was one of the very first to understand the dangers of genetic engineering, and who brought a huge, and he was an extraordinarily talented author in books like Entropy and Alchemy and Biosphere Politics. And so I had the privilege of working with him for about 7.5 years, and that here in Washington, D.C., where we're speaking today. And so I went from there to Washington, D.C., and working with Jeremy and working with Ralph Nader. They really were my mentors, as far as becoming an activist, learning how to talk to the media, learning the power of litigation, learning the power of how litigation can inform grassroots organizing through getting discovery that they can then use. I mean, there was just so many things I learned, from them. I'm very grateful to them. So I'm not a self-made person at all. I stand on the shoulders of all these people and so many others, like the brilliant E.F. Schumacher and Ted Rozak and all these wonderful authors who I learned so much from. And of course, my great mentor, Father Thomas Berry. Folks, if you don't know Thomas Berry, get to know him, the dream of the earth, the great work. And Thomas remained a great friend and a great mentor until his death about a decade ago.
Tell us about your path to the Supreme Court, because not many people go from learning from Ralph Nader in grad school to actually putting his words into practice and taking cases to the Supreme Court, which would determine the rules of the game around how genetically engineered plants are regulated and overseen by the federal government.
Right. Well, the work that I do and that we do at the Center for Food Safety is administrative law. And what that means is that there's many acts were passed, in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, even the Endangered Species Act a little bit later, Toxic Substance Control Act, the law that regulates pesticides. And so what we do is when the government is not doing its job, we sue the government. Right. It's a full-time job because the government usually is full of people who've been either supported by corporations through in their elected office or who are going through the revolving door. They work for the industry, they go into EPA, then they revolve back to the industry, then back to EPA. So now I'm at Monsanto, now I'm at EPA, now I'm at USDA. It's this huge revolving door. So there's a tremendous amount of corruption. That's the only word I have for it. It's corruption. Corruption. And so one of the few ways we have to address that is through litigation. Right, because if you try and get through the ag committees at either state or the federal level for legislation, good luck. Those ag committees are really stuffed with the people that are supporting big ag, supporting the polluters. So the courts become the avenue to do that. I wish it weren't so. I wish our legislatures were doing their job, but they're not. So the courts, and so it becomes very dramatic, because sometimes for example, the EPA throughout the 90s. I started the Greenhouse Crisis Foundation in 1988, 89. I filed the first litigation on climate change in 88, 89. I organized Earth Day in New York based around climate in 1989. We organized the first faith community, the National Council of Churches, around climate change. Well, it wasn't even through the 90s. The EPA was not in any way addressing the climate crisis. It was not regulating greenhouse gases, which is incredible. Right, it's the Environmental Protection Agency and so that's one example. So me and my legal director Joe Mendelson at the time, we looked at it and we said, let's petition them. Let's say EPA, you've got to do this. And we found in law that they actually were required to do it. Well, we thought Gore was going to be president, and he had agreed already that he would give in to our petition to do it. But when the election was stolen and Bush became president, right, they said no way. Either it doesn't exist, meaning the climate crisis, or if it does exist, the EPA doesn't have the authority. So for 7 years, we fought that all the way to the Supreme Court, right? And then in 2007, the Supreme Court, in a case called Mass v. EPA, in a 5-4 vote, said yes, the climate crisis exists, and yes, EPA has the authority and must use that authority to regulate greenhouse gases. So it was an 8-year process. But that's what you have to do, administrative law. And we did the same thing, with genetically engineered crops. It was not clear at all that farmers who'd been contaminated with these crops had any way to address the situation in any way to be compensated for these losses. We took it all the way to the Supreme Court and we won 8-1, right? The patenting of life, we said, is absolutely ridiculous that corporations get to patent life. And it's really only since the Reagan administration that really happened. There was no patenting of life, in our patent law until 1980. And all the way through, suddenly you could patent microbes, patent plants, patent animals. And the only reason you couldn't patent humans was the prohibition against slavery. Otherwise, probably said that as well. And so we went to the Supreme Court of that, and the Supreme Court did hold that you could not patent DNA. So,
can you just explain to our listeners how the prohibition against slavery applies to genetic engineering?
Well, the prohibition against slavery applies to the fact that if you were to genetically engineer a human being and then patent them, like you're genetically engineering soy and patenting it, you're genetic engineering a pig and patenting it. Well, if you're genetic engineering a human, you can say, I'm patenting you. And I control everything you do for the next 17 to 21 years. Genetically engineered Ashley, I'm sure you're happy that you got genetically engineered. Maybe it helped, maybe it didn't. But meanwhile, I've got you. You're my patented commodity, right? The patent says.
Is that litigated?
No, when the Supreme Court when the Patent Office allowed for the patenting of animals, it at the end of it said, not all animals, not human beings, all animals except human beings. So, because again, the prohibition on slavery, because otherwise you would own that person, right? For 17 to 21, depending on when the patent's old. So it was, I wrote a lot on that essays, and we definitely have litigated many times. And we've also lost in the Supreme Court, several times on patenting. So it's, litigation is hard. It's very difficult. I think the two hardest things to do in our work is long-term grassroots organizing to get a movement going. It takes years and years, and with no assured success. And the same thing with long-term litigation on these really important issues. You can go year after year, and you don't know what's going to end. With maybe the Supreme Court, you lose 5-4 after 8, 9, 10 years of litigation. So it's it takes a certain kind of perseverance, a certain kind of character to do both of those things. To do those kinds of things, it takes so much time and energy and so much passion.
What did it feel like? What does it feel like when you win at the Supreme Court? And what does it feel like when you lose?
It feels, victory is victory, and that's a lovely deal. And, I do remember a friend of ours who was at the victory party after we won the Mass v. EPA case, which finally, some people to this day consider the most important environmental case in American digital history. But it did take 8 years. And a friend of mine came up and said, I'm not so why we are celebrating. What are we celebrating here? It took 8 years to have EPA do the obvious, which is regulate greenhouse gases. And who knows how long it's going to take them, right, to do anything about this regulation. So that was kind of a downer, to be honest with you. Come on, we're celebrating here. What? Hey, have another drink. Maybe that'll help. But he was very prescient because the industry has come in and litigated against EPA on any element, any area they try to, it can have any aspect of regulating greenhouse gases. And in comes the industry. Now you can't do that. And we just saw a case in the Supreme Court, West Virginia, where they actually said, even though that it was a power plant plan to get rid of coal burning power plants, even though that had been rescinded, they said, we're not going to care the fact that what we're litigating on doesn't even exist. We're still going to rule on it and say that is EPA acting in an unauthorized fashion, acting beyond its authority. So I have a thing on this, by the way. I'll get into the lawsuit in a second. So right now, what they're trying to do in the Supreme Court and what they're trying to do at the Federalist Society, other people that are the thinkers behind all of this that we're saying, is they're trying to dismantle the regulatory state. And I just mentioned the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all those things are based in regulation. EPA, USDA, FDA, right? Department of Interior, right? All those agencies, right? They want to get rid of them at the federal level and are so kneecapped their power that they can't do anything to address climate or the extinction crisis, right? That is what they want. That's what the corporations want. They want to return us back to sort of, 70, 80 years ago before any of this happened. I'm saying, well, if you want that, let's give it to them. Because what they're doing, what these corporations are doing, are actually crimes. They're criminal, right? Your pesticide making, monarch butterflies, bees extinct, that's biocide. You are destroying a species. That should be a crime, and you should go to jail. You do mountaintop removal and destroy an entire ecosystem. That is a crime of ecocide. Anytime you destroy an eco niche, that's a crime. We shouldn't be suing you. Oh, hopefully this thing, and then I'll go to the EPA and maybe the USDA will do something about it. Let's call it a crime. Let's call it what it is. Let's move environmental law from administrative law, which I've been doing my whole life, and move it into criminal law, because that's what it is. And what's the greatest crime of all? It's destroying the planet. So the term there is terroricide. So I'm actually now working with a bunch of lawyers to come up with a criminal code for these polluters, for these destroyers of the planet, saying, okay, biocide, ecocide, terroricide. And of course, anybody who's fostering the climate crisis, that's straight out terroricide. That's destroying the planet itself. Now you can be guilty of all three. So like manslaughter, second degree murder, first degree murder, right? You get all three. But I think it's long past due that the environmental movement, and including the environmental legal movement and community, says these are crimes. And at least, even though it is aspirational at this point, that we do have laws on the book making it criminal to kill marine mammals, making it criminal to kill certain birds. So it's not, we do have some precedent, right? But it's long overdue that we begin to speak in terms of this. These are crimes. And of course, ultimately, they're crimes against ourselves as well, right? Because if we destroy the biodiversity we rely on, those pesticides are giving us cancer, right? When we overuse antibiotics, it's going to come back and haunt us, right? So our war against nature is always going to end up being a war against ourselves because we're part of nature. But right now, I think it's really important that we begin to speak in terms of criminal law, environmental law is criminal law, and these actions is criminal.
And you arrive at this because you found the long-term efficacy of administrative law to be waning. I mean, this feels like a necessary step. And yet, is this because your work to ensure that we have good laws on the books and that those laws are properly administrated is failing to accomplish what your ultimate goal is, which is the preservation, restoration, and vibrancy of our planet?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Ashley. I mean, we're talking about my 30 plus years of litigation in this area, but we're also talking about that of many of my wonderful colleagues going back even into the 70s. And meanwhile, everything is getting worse and worse and worse, right? If you look at that, again, consider maybe the most famous case in American environmental jurisprudence, Master EPA. What's happened since then, right? What's happened in the 12, 13 years since then? Very little. EPA has been able to do very little, not nothing, but very little. And meanwhile, how's the fossil fuel companies? How have they been doing? They've been doing just great, right? 20, 30 billion of our tax subsidies go to them. They got $200 billion in profit. Now they're price gouging like they've just been doing. We won the most important case, they say. And how did that actually fundamentally change things? So I'm guessing that if we come to the point where the Attorney General of a state or the Attorney General of the country says, I'm announcing indictments today, the heads of these corporations, right? And they're going to go to jail, right? Massive criminal fines, criminal punishment. I think we'd see a far different environment than we see out there. I think that the administrative law and great stuff's been done. I'm not negating my work. Our colleagues, we've stopped so many pesticides, stop so many terrible things from happening. GMOs, the successes we've had are really impressive, but they haven't been sufficient. And I think part of that is that we need to, again, recognize that administrative law, and then on top of that, now the right wing is tearing down administrative law. So it already was waning, to use your word. Now they're actually consciously, and this is just the beginning, ripping it down anyway, so limiting the agency's capacity to work for the protection of the planet, our health, that they just won't be effective. So, hey, you want to get rid of administrative law? You're welcome. Now we're going to put you, we're going to end up in criminal court for you. Congratulations.
So what I'm hearing in your story, and I think it's like an important kind of message to our listeners, is that we can't stay committed to the tactic. We have to continue focusing on the goal. And if the tactics you're using, in your case, you went from administrative law, litigating quite successfully up to the Supreme Court, realizing, no, that's not going to work. Let's figure out a new tactic, a new way to get at it. And I'm also hearing you say that you can't have your strategies, your legal strategy, exist in a vacuum. You also need to build social movements. And I know we chatted yesterday with Vandana about just sort of y'all's long-term participation in the movement for reclaiming human and earth power from corporations. Tell us a little bit about that work, like the movement building work.
Yeah, and I think that that brings us to sort of what's the theory of change here.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of what's behind all this. Sometimes we don't get to that, and so years ago I wrote a piece in Utne, the Utne magazine, Utne Reader magazine, and I called it "The New Age versus the New Left." Okay, so for those people who are not boomers listening, which I hope is the vast majority of you, maybe there's some background necessary, but the New Left pretty much was built out of the Vietnam War movement, and it was very strong, very activist oriented. Action, civil disobedience, action at the court level, you name it, right? And the New Age movement was all about lifestyle. And the story goes like this. So this drunk, he trips out of a bar, gets in the street, and is hit by a car. And he's lying on the street, and he's bleeding. And the New Left guy immediately gets up, gets a tourniquet, stops the bleeding, takes his coat, puts it under his head, says, "Call 911. You're going to let him breathe." Does all the things you need to do to try and save this guy's life, right? And the New Age guy is sitting there going, "Oh boy, this guy is terrible. I mean, I wonder what compensatory compulsion is leading him to have to drink. I wonder why, and oh my goodness. I mean, look, he's emaciated, he hasn't been eating right. This guy is just a mess." And that story was a joke against the New Age. Because while the guy's saving his life, the other guy's commenting on his lifestyle. But the more I thought about that story, I wondered if it was really a joke against the New Age. Because unless you change his lifestyle, unless you change the way he's thinking, unless you understand, unless you get some psychological help, unless he changes the way he thinks and acts, he's going to be on that street again. He's going to get hurt again. So that's when I say, no, it takes two things for this sort of theory of change. One is to stop the bleeding. That's the New Left guy. Other thing is to change the consciousness. Because unless you do, there's never going to be enough people to stop the bleeding. Unless we change the consciousness that is behind that. And that's been my theory of change ever since. So yes, we've got to file our litigations. Yes, we have to organize against all sorts of, you name it, that they're doing out there. But unless we change the consciousness of what's behind it, there'll never be enough of us. So sometimes there's a war between these two, actually, right? People say, that GMO case was about alfalfa. Why did you devote 7 years of your life and your stuff to litigating against GMO alfalfa all the way to the Supreme Court? You should be writing essays, giving public speeches. That was just a waste of who you are, right? And then the people who are doing the work saying, we stopped that pesticide. We just vacated the approval of glyphosate. That's the work, my friends, not airy-fairy articles about this or that, right? So they often actually oppose each other, at least implicitly, if not explicitly. And that's a mistake. They really need to go together. And that's always been my vision for my organization and also for my life. And I shouldn't say our organization and my life, which is, yeah, stop the bleeding, but you also need to change the consciousness. So books like Fatal Harvest or my earlier, book, The Human Body Shop, others, they're there to also change the consciousness. And so people say, okay, so you might ask, what do you mean change the consciousness? And of course, that's a very difficult question. It gets into some deep philosophical and metaphysical realms. But if you just look at some very simple paradigms, right? Why do we think that we can exhaust elements of the earth, right? Trees, soil, fish, water, you name it, faster than they can regenerate itself? Why do we think we can do that? And why do we continue to do that? Our entire economic system, our entire industrial civilization is based on that we can just keep extracting, regardless of how much is left. That's pathological. If you had that society on the couch, you'd say, this is a really dysfunctional pattern. This is maladaptive to your long-term survival, right? But we do. Why do we think that somehow we can spray these toxins over all of our farmland to kill insects, to kill, fungi, to kill, so-called weeds, and that they won't adapt? That we just can always kill them in perpetually. That's crazy. That goes against second grade science. So the failure to understand that we need to respect the regenerative capacity of nature, that our economy cannot be based on supply and demand because the fish haven't read Adam Smith, they haven't read von Hayek, they haven't read any of those things. They regenerate at their own pace, no matter how much human supply and demand issues there are. So our entire economic system based on supply and demand is completely disembedded from the regenerative capacities of nature. That's delusional, right? That leads to scarcity and ultimately extinction, right? And so the same is true with poisoning nature, which then poisons ourselves. So behind that, I have this idea of maybe there's something like human privilege. Maybe as humans, especially in the technological industrial age, not so much with indigenous people, certainly, do we really think that nature is there for our purposes? Do we think all of nature is there just to serve man, to serve humans? I think we do. I think there's this kind of a weird consciousness shift where we somehow think nature is derivative of us. That the earth is derivative of us. That's not true. We are derivative of the earth, right? How the earth fares is how we're going to fare. But that seems to be a very difficult consciousness shift for people to make. And there's many of those consciousness shifts. Another one, of course, would be the nation state, right? The nation state is a political entity, has nothing to do with ecology, right? So the weeds don't care, butterflies don't care, no pollution doesn't care, and no one really cares about your political division, right? So there's all of these delusions, denials, and projections that keep us from the central understanding that the care and promotion of the planet is really the most important thing that we can do on a daily basis, and we can do it through stopping the bleeding and changing this sort of human privilege, this idea that the whole world is natural resources for us, not for the whales, not for the bees, so for the trees. So that's what I mean by consciousness shifting. It's hard work, and you have to think it through, and you have to think out the paradigms. So that's work is equal to stopping the bleeding. Both really important if we're going to make some progress.
It also lays out an opportunity for so many different skill sets to come forward and sort of enlist themselves in this work. We've had folks on this podcast that are artists, we've had meditation teacher, we've had lawyers, we've had scholars, we've had journalists, and it's all of us together understanding the sort of two fronts that we're fighting, that feels really important and resonant in that theory of change. Because so often we think like, well, that person's not really doing good work. Like they need to get serious, or they need to be a scientist, but it's the totality, the holism of the revolution that's necessary to kind of fundamentally shift us out of this mode.
Yeah, I mean, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I'm a huge believer in using the arts and having our faith communities become more and more deeply involved. I mean, we have so much of our therapeutic community deals only with individuals, but doesn't apply its, the brilliant concepts of the dynamic psychologists of the 20th century to our collective, to our culture, to our societies. And there's some brilliant people that are doing that. Tom Singer, for example, and others talk about the cultural complex. So there are people who are now applying that, and I would refresh both fields. It would let psychology really expand itself into a larger understanding of the psychology of power, psychology of authoritarianism, psychology of culture, right? And meanwhile, it would amplify politics with a deeper understanding of the psychological underpinnings of why we do what we do. Why do people oppose Obamacare? Why do so many Americans think that people shouldn't have health care? Why is that? What's behind that? What's the thinking behind that? What's the psychology behind that? And I think some of it might be social Darwinism, is that people think that, they have that inner idea that we're a social Darwinian society. There's the tigers and the zebras. There's the makers and the takers, right? Deep embedded in our psychology. Very, very dysfunctional, very, very, really a cruel kind of narrative. So yeah, lots to be done there.
To go back to the question though, about like, how does it feel to lose and how does it feel to win? I'm also wondering how it feels to sort of be someone in this work that's dedicated their entire life to trying to save this planet and watching the continued acceleration of species degradation and climate change. Like, how do you navigate sort of what at times, even for me, feels like hopelessness?
Yeah, no, years ago, I was litigating to stop the sale of bovine growth hormone, which was the very first genetically engineered product to hit the market in the United States, Monsanto. And it was really a steroid that they gave to cows to soup up their milk production. Very cruel, led to mastitis, many other diseases among cows. And I'd worked on a dairy farm for several summers of my life when I was a late teenager. And so I really wanted to win this case, and because I knew the suffering it was going to cause. And it was also Monsanto's flagship product. So we lost the case in Wisconsin. We won some preliminary motions, but we lost the case. And I was very depressed. And my older brother, Mark, I was on the phone with him, and because he'd worked on the dairy farm with me, I said, Mark, this really hurts really badly. And I'm really disappointed. And Mark said, it sounds like you really wanted to be successful. I said, yeah. He said, you're not called to be successful. Right? He said, you're called to be faithful. You're called to be faithful to what you see and do the very best you can. The rest is beyond your pay scale. And I think, especially for those of us who also have a spiritual perspective here, right? You see this also in spiritual terms, as I do. We're just called to be faithful, to do this work, to care and promote that. That's what we're called to do. And to analyze and to work and to do the best that our talents allow us to do, to bring our best to the work as much as we can and to the work. And that's it. You have to be at peace after that. You have to say, you have to actually, even if you lose, say, well, and this happens in our organization. Hey, great job, everyone. Of course, we're disappointed. We're not hiding that. But we also secretly are also not disappointed because we did our best. We were faithful to what we thought needed to happen, and we did the best we could. The result, some judge who appointed by Trump or whatever, some of that's beyond our ability to change and beyond our pay scale to predict. So yeah, if you're not, I think you can get burned out a lot, and I think you can feel hopeless. But if you realize this is your job is to be faithful. Once you've done that, that's your job. I don't care, and you're not going to get burned out no matter how old you get. If that's the way you can really feel that and feel that peace, that deep peace of saying, I did the job, I was faithful to what I did. Now that's different if you feel for some reason you weren't able to apply yourself well, and you say, I got to learn, I got to fail forward on that. We've got to fail forward as an organization. We could have done better on that, and that's very constructive as well. But I think ultimately you're not required to be successful. You're called to be faithful.
It reminds me, there's a term in Native Hawaiian, Kuleana, and the concept is it's like a blending of responsibility and birthright. It's like this work that we're doing is something greater than just your 9 to 5. It's a body of work. It's a life's work. And I really like I've been with you when we've lost. And I've felt the deep, I don't even know how to describe it. For me personally, it feels like the ground falls out from under you and you kind of lose your breath for a second. But in the ways that we've lost, I also know that because we're faithful, we've actually also won because things have changed and we've shifted the consciousness, and maybe we lost in the courts, but then we brought it back to the legislature. And if we didn't have that long arc to sort of stay tuned into, maybe we would have quit with the sort of momentary loss and not focused on the long-term shifting that loss enabled. And then we get a win. I mean, that's what we had in Hawaii. We lost in the courts. The courts determined that counties didn't have the authority to regulate agriculture, but that incentivized the states to change the rules of the game. And Hawaii became one of the first, I think the first state in the nation to ban chlorpyrifos, for example. So I'm liking that sort of holistic long-term approach.
It's beyond our pace to predict. Canada ended up banning BGH. And then we ended up getting labeling of BGH, which killed it in the marketplace 10, 15 years later. So, I didn't know that at the time. So you also, it's a really good point. Actually, you don't know really how that work is going to, it's going to carry itself out. And, I also think that working on consciousness work also is really helpful, because, we may have lost that stop the bleeding thing, but have we, as you said, have we changed the consciousness here? Are people understanding more and more that the human economy has to be a wholly owned subsidiary of ecology, that our war against nature is a war against ourselves, and we see what's happening with antibiotics or with fungicides, how that's rebounding on our own health. The message is getting through, the narrative is getting through, I think, and we're seeing more and more young people, I think, especially getting involved in the environmental movement, getting involved in the anti-animal factory movement. I think it's so much of that. I really begin to see a change of consciousness. Organic is the fastest growing sector in American agriculture right now. So there's so much that I'm seeing, this amazing interest in soil. The fact that people are now excited about soil, documentaries, even the USDA has gotten excited about it, believe it or not, doing some really phenomenal work, and understand that soil is a way to address the climate crisis. It's going to help sequester that carbon. It's going to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's wonderful to see some of those changes in one's lifetime as well. Not enough, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. But so I find that really encouraging. And I think the food movement is particularly exciting, because the food movement is one of those areas in our society where each person can make a difference, right? In what you choose to buy, what you choose to grow, what you choose to have your schools feed your kids, right? You can make a difference. As much as I love Ralph Nader, I've never liked the idea of consumer. Fires consume. They used to call tuberculosis consumption because it consumed the bodies. What a horrible thing to think of ourselves as humanity, that we're all consumers. It's really so reductionist about who we are as people. We are not consumers, we're creators. And every decision we make is going to create a continuing future of the devastation of industrial agriculture, devastating to the planet, devastating to our health, devastating to animals and plants, or to the new organic and beyond future that so many of us are trying to do. I now have that under the BROAD, the broad approach to the food future, which is biodiverse, regenerative, organic, agroecological, and democratic. BROAD, right? Biodiverse, regenerative, organic, agroecological, and democratic. So that's the vision, right? And every decision we make, we're creators. I don't always make the right decision. I'm not always on top of that mountain, but at least we have to take the responsibility. Am I going to create that future? Or I'm going to create that future? Right? It's like that. And some old guru was saying to a group of his students, he was saying, there's there's two tigers in you. There's a tiger that can eat you up with ambition and greed. And there's a tiger that can support the deepest and best parts of yourself. And they're fighting. And one of the students says, but Guru, who's going to win? He said, the one you feed. Right? You're the one that's going to decide. So we are not consumers, we're creators. And by the way, I would extend that beyond food. Don't just listen to music, folks. Make music. Don't just read poems. Write poems, right? Don't just read romance novels. Have a romance. We've so learned to be receptacles of all this, and that changes us versus, no, I'm a creator. I can create this. Here's my garden. Here's my new poem. You may not like it. I'm not saying I'm a great poet, but I loved writing it. I loved, learning that piece of music. I love, the archetype of every God image that we have is the creator. So when in anything you do, you see yourself as a creator and you act as a creator, you are acting in imago Dei. You are acting in the image of God, because that is the fundamental archetype of every culture's, every faith tradition's God is the creator. Right.
And sort of go back to where we began, it reminds me of a conversation that we had yesterday about what is some of the obvious early impacts of doing that inner work, kind of focusing on yourself and working through your trauma. And you told the story of a client who finally found the space within herself and in her life to write her novel. And maybe in order for us all to step into our power as earth warriors and earth creators and allow the earth to move through us in the ways that we uniquely can, we also have to focus on doing that inner work and figuring out how we might get in our own way of being in our dharma and in our strength and in our purpose or in our Kuleana.
Yeah, we're really well said, Ashley. I think that's right. And I think there's, when we talk about freedom, freedom is something you earn, because if you are still being governed by your complexes, you're still being, governed by toxic people in your life, you're not really free. Freedom really has to do with the inner work. And when you want to get into this work as a free person, you want to be free for your critical thinking, free to know that you're not commingling your inner emotions that you need to be dealing with over here, commingling that with your work. Or goodness knows how you're treating your colleagues. We can't fight for more humane society and not have a humane workplace, and a fair, equitable, and empathetic workplace. That is unacceptable. I've been early on in my career. I worked in workplaces like that, and the contradiction and the hypocrisy was overwhelming. So we don't do that, and I don't. So I think that having that depth of freedom. And I have a lot of compassion, actually. If you think of the whole history of human consciousness, right, it was mostly local. The Apaches or the Aborigines or the medieval Europeans, it was pretty much local. So all you had to do is, now there can be traumatic and terrible things that happen locally, don't get me wrong. But in the last few generations, we've had to think of nuclear holocaust that would nuclear winter, destroy the entire planet. That I grew up with that, right? I didn't really know a time when that wasn't the case. Well, no one had ever thought of that in the whole history of humankind before that. Well, that generation, this generation has to, wow, that is a huge amount. The temptation is if you deny it or not to try and think about it. It's so terrible. It's so overwhelming. The psychic numbing that Lifton talked about, right? That Robert Lifton talked about. So, and then now with the climate crisis or the extinction crisis. So I have a lot of compassion for people who say, I don't want to deal with that. I'm worried about my mortgage. We just fell into the poverty line because of COVID. Excuse me, everybody. I got stuff to do here. My daughter needs to be fed. I get that. And that's actually more normal for humans. So we're asking humanity to develop a consciousness at a global level and an imagination for catastrophe that's never had to have before. So I think rather than constantly blaming people or how it's the matter with people, how come you can't get it, the climate crisis, or why do we have peace? I think we need to realize that this is asking a huge amount of the human. It's necessary. It's urgent. We have to do it. But wow, in just this few generations, to have to deal on a daily basis, that is a tremendous stress. That is a tremendous amount of evolution that has to happen in a very, very short period of time.
I was thinking a little bit about our nervous systems, and that's been a lot of the work that I've been doing internally, is recognizing when my nervous system is out of whack, and that causes me to act in certain ways. But I've also been noticing that the influences on my nervous system are global. It's like I read about the Uyghurs in China, and I'm suddenly in a sort of quasi-triggered state. And it's like, I don't really know if these bodies are designed to absorb the information that's readily available to us at a scroll. And it almost, I mean, because I don't plan to get off the internet and go into a bunker and erase my exposure to these things, it's almost required me to develop equally as innovative a self-care regimen so that I can stay in a calm, grounded, secure state to then be able to take action in the ways that I need to take action, right? And I've been in positions in my life where I've been able to influence things globally. I think our work in Hawaii around GE crops and pesticides had a global reverberating effect. But most of the time, I need to find my grounded place so that I can just be kind inside my family, be compassionate inside my workplace, and try to make the change reverberate from there.
Yeah, I mean that is the goal of a huge amount of inner work. You know, the peace that surpasses all understanding. But I don't think I would be remiss if I let industrial capitalism off the hook. You know, the commodification of nature, the commodification of life, and the commodification of us. You know, reminds me of the old Greek myth of Midas, right? Midas saves a favorite of Dionysus, and Dionysus says, "Okay, I'll give you a wish." And Midas says, "Oh, Midas has always been a little bit of a guy, greedy guy. Everything I touch turns to gold." And Dionysus says, "You really want to do that? Are you sure you want to do this?" And I said, "Yeah." And so, sure enough, next morning he wakes up, touches a twig, gold. Touches an apple, gold. And he can't believe it. Everything he touches turns gold. Touches the pillar of his home, gold. Right? And he's celebrating. This is going to be great. And then he picks up, apple to eat, gold, can't eat it. Water turns out to gold, can't drink it. And now he starts getting more and more nervous and more desperate. Suddenly his daughter runs in and he hugs her and says, "Oh my God, I think I did something wrong." She turns into gold. So very quickly he goes back to Dionysus. He says, "Please, I've sinned. I have sinned." That's the word they use. "I've sinned. Relieve me from my request." And Dionysus says, "Okay." But that's sort of a metaphor for our entire society. We've turned everything into commodity. How does it feel to be a commodity as a human being? Eric Fromm is the only psychologist I know who went into that. How does it feel to go into a job interview? How does it feel to be a commodity barely making minimum wage, but still trying to do that job? How does it feel to know that I'm a commodity, maybe even in my marriage or relationships, right? From the boardroom to the bedroom, how we've commodified virtually everything. And how does it feel to be a rejected commodity? How does that feel? How do you internalize that self-worth, right? So, the commodification of the world is really not, as far as consciousness shift, we're not commodities. Nature isn't a commodity, right? Nothing in nature is a commodity. To define a tree as a commodity for lumber, to us as a commodity for labor, right? That denies our full humanity. And it denies the essence of what is a tree, right? So, or plant. So, these consciousness shifts go very, very deep. And I think to have an economic system like industrial capitalism that it's so disembedded from our nature. I mean, how many people need psychotropic medication to get through the day? Just to get through their day, it's about 60 million. How many need some medication to get through the night? I'm raising my hand on that one too, by the way, sometimes. About 80 million. So I tell people, don't worry about the genetic engineering of humans. We're already being chemically engineered to fit into this society, which is so dehumanizing and makes them. And we even have 500,000 kids under the age of 5 who are on psychotropic medication, so they can fit within the school system. So I see they're never going to successfully genetically engineer humans because genetic engineering is they got the science wrong. There's so many more things than DNA that make us who we are, even at the molecular levels, RNA and epigenetics. Right now they're at the abacus stage and nature's like a computer. That's sort of where we are in genetic engineering. Don't worry about that. Put that on the back burner for generations, if ever. But we are being chemically engineered, right? To finish up, which is completely disembedded from our deepest needs, from the deepest aspects of who we are, and forcing us into become labor. That's something called labor. Not humans, labor. That's what they call us, right? We're human resources.
Yeah, I'm thinking deeply about a young child I met on my recent travels whose parents had put him on Ritalin at 8 years old. And I just had this moment where I really had compassion for the frustrations of the parents who were both working home through COVID and trying to make it happen. And they couldn't get their kid to sit down in a desk and sit on his computer and pay attention. And it felt like, yeah, exactly what you're saying. We're trying to redesign the child to fit inside an economy that's also exploiting parents. It's this really terrifying loop.
Yeah, years ago, many years ago, there was a play about the Vietnam War off Broadway in New York, and it was called The Rescue. And briefly, what happens in this play is that a pilot who's been doing bomb forays over North Vietnam, 30,000 feet, ordnance being hitting all these farms, he gets shot down, and the play begins with him like with a broken leg, and a farmer takes him in, Vietnamese farmer, and people come, hey, did you see the pilot? They want to punish him and put him in a POW camp, but the old man doesn't believe in that, so he keeps him there. He heals him, and it turns out, of course, he has a beautiful daughter, and the pilot falls in love with the daughter, falls in love with this sort of isolated farm, and over a couple of years, he gets into the rhythm of the farm, and he develops a real love and affection for this old farmer and his daughter. And the denouement of the play happens when a group of Green Berets has illegally gone into North Vietnam to rescue him. That's why it's called The Rescue. And they show up and they say, okay, and he's delighted to see his American friends. And they said, yeah, this is great. There's one problem. We broke international law to get you, right? So we have to kill the farmer and the daughter as witnesses to our breach of international law. And he says, you can't do that. They saved me. You can't do that. And they say, those are orders, son. End of story. So he argues and argues, but loses. So finally he says, okay, let me do it myself. At least I think I'm doing it. Let me do it. And so he goes in the room, and after a very short time, he shoots himself. Mm. I loved the plot of that play, because here he was before 30,000 feet, dropping all this ordnance, killing these people, but it was distanced. It was distanced. But when he had to do it himself, the people he loved and people he cared about, he couldn't do it. Mm. So I came up with this idea of cold evil. This idea that so many of the evils that we're fighting in this world are cold evils. What's going on in the 10 billion animals in this country, animal factories. And the fact that we have intercontinental ballistic missiles that could destroy us all, is all at a distance. Technology allows us incredible distance, right? We loan a lot of money to these countries in the global south, and then they can't pay back. So we have structural adjustment, where we say you have to cut down your education, cut your health care, cut any benefits that you give. And so kids are dying. People are dying. I remember the Institute for Policy Studies said it probably is about 3,000 to 4,000 kids a week dying because of this starvation, lack of health care. Imagine if a person were doing that, killing 3,000 or 4,000 kids a week, right? So that's cold evil. But what's happening with the climate? That's the extinction crisis. These are all these cold systems, technological, capitalist, industrial systems of extraction, profit man, that are actually creating these evils. And you can go to your synagogue, you can go to your church, I'm sure you can go to your mosque, and they talk about hot evil, like fanatics, or what happened at 9/11, or, violence, rape, sinfulness, whatever. But that's not the majority of what's the problem. The majority of the problem we're facing is cold evil. And the only answer I know to that is relationship. get in relationship to those animals and fight so they don't suffer like that. On our food work, CSA, go get CSA, know where your food comes from, right? Become a creator, right? And that's where I think you see the growth of the organic movement. I see the growth. Look at Cesar Chavez, right? Cesar Chavez said, don't buy those grapes unless you think about the people and the families that are picking them. Hmm. Shouldn't you care? I think you should. Are they getting education? Are they being poisoned by the pesticides? You can't just buy the grapes. That's cold evil. Hmm. Cold evil survives on a very cold consciousness ethic. Hmm. One of them is efficiency, right? Maximum production, minimum effort, minimum time. Or what about Audrey, your daughter? Mm-hmm. You want to treat her efficiently? Mm-hmm. Minimum input of affection and minimum time for maximum good grades and good behavior. Mm. Would you be a good mom? No. If I would get a call at 2 a.m. from my friend, hey, Jim just left me. Oh, no, I'm so sorry. That's so bad. But, I've got a podcast tomorrow and this is an inefficient phone call. Do we treat anything we care about on an efficiency basis? No. What do we treat? Empathy and, dare we say the word, love. Hmm. I haven't yet had the courage to go in front of a federal court judge.
Tell him you love him.
Tell him I love, the reason I'm here is because we love this river, or we love these farmers, or we love this community. I haven't done it yet. One of these days I will. Or gone in front of a congressional committee and said, we're here to speak for love. One of these days I might do it.
Yeah, that's right.
Look at another one just quickly is competition, right? We want to compete, right? We want to compete with the world. That's why we have these trade agreements, right? Competition, right? But what I had a daughter and a son. Let's say they my daughter Kuleana and my son Nicholas. Let's say when they were still in school, they come back and Kuleana's got an A report card. Nick's only got a B minus. Nick, you are the weakest link. Goodbye. I have to prepare you for the competitive world we're all going to live in, right? And competition is the ethic of elimination. It's really, if you see all those movies where, Arnold Schwarzenegger or somebody, they kill people and they shove their head in the toilet. Everyone's eliminating everybody all the time in computer games. That's just a reenactment of competition. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to destroy your company. We're going to destroy you on the football field. We're going to get rid of them. They're gone. That's all this ethic of competition. And again, where's cooperation and where's empathy? So these are the consciousness shifts that cold evil, and that's why the society sometimes can be so very, very cold. It's not just the practice of cold evil, it's the thinking that's behind it, including the idea of thinking of ourselves as consumers.
So we're almost out of time, but we've been sort of dancing around this concept of shifting our consciousness. And we've talked about how important internal work is to sort of enabling yourself to be able to shift your consciousness, maybe out of old narratives, the narratives that society has given you, the mindsets that have been handed down. And we've talked about how once you've done that internal work, you can kind of show up and allow the earth to move through you, allow yourself to be enlisted in whatever your unique role is in saving this planet. And we've also gotten to see all the different ways that you've shifted around in your career. What is the one piece of advice you would give somebody who's coming to activism and feeling a sense of maybe curiosity or dismay or confusion about what to do next?
I'm afraid I think my advice might be a little disappointing. Because I could not be where I am. I could not have done virtually anything that I've done without mentors, without Rachel Carson. I mentioned Cesar Chavez, without seeing them, without the incredible wisdom of E.F. Schumacher and Jacques Ellul and Ted Rozak is Where the Wasteland Ends, and Jeremy Rifkin and Ralph Nader. I didn't just invent myself out of whole cloth somehow. And the ideas that I'm talking about the iPod, I mean, half of them I could say, okay, that one I got from Louis Mumford. That was Thomas Berry. Oh, Jeremy was Rifkin as well. I mean, and yes, you move them forward, but it is their work that you're standing on. You're standing on their shoulders, I guess is the common expression. So that would be my advice. Read. Some of the people I just talked about, I think, are really, really important. As I said, Thomas Berry and E.F. Schumacher would be a great start. Oh, and by the way, Vandana Shiva, who we had a podcast with yesterday. Yeah, learn. And because that's what you're going to need to move forward. Listen, podcasts, listen, learn, just be like a sponge and take it all in, because that's what you're going to need. You can't invent it out of yourself. None of us is that talented. And by the way, the same with learning an instrument, same with learning music. What would I be? Where would I be without Jung? Where would Jung have been without Freud? Where would almost any of the post-Jungians be? Where would that whole therapeutic? It's all built on other people's work. You can't reinvent the wheel. You have to use what they did to go forward, especially in these urgent times. So I know it's not a very sexy or edgy answer, but that would be for young activists, people who are activists. You want to have the grounding, inner and outer grounding, that are going to prepare you for the truly monumental tasks ahead.
Well, it's a perfect way to end, because that's how we began when I said that you were my mentor. And so much of what I've learned has been from you. So
It's been a joy and remains a joy.
Don't I know it? All right. Thanks, Andy.
Blessings.
I have to pee so bad.